Okay, started. Okay, let's go. Hello everyone, and thank you for joining. I am Evangelos Yfantidis, current chair of the Second Young Member Subcommittee, and today I have the pleasure of welcoming you to our lunchtime webinar on the San Ramon fault, seismic hazard assessment, and controversy surrounding a new seismic scenario. Before we begin, please let me go through some housekeeping rules and important information. I will first kindly ask you to keep your video cameras off and microphones on mute for the duration of the presentations. But just to clarify, this is applicable only for the audience, so I would like to invite the speakers to keep their video cameras on if possible. After our two speakers finish with their presentations, we will have some time for a Q&A session in the end. But in the meantime, please feel free to type any questions you might have in the chat. And please also note that this webinar is being recorded and will be later uploaded on our second YouTube channel. And therefore, by dialing into today's event, you consent that any views or information you share will be made public. Moving on, I will now introduce our two speakers. Our first speaker is Horacio Domínguez, holder of a master's degree in civil engineering sciences from Federico Santa Maria Technical University, with expertise in performance-based earthquake engineering, particularly emphasizing probabilistic seismic hazard analysis. During the pursuit of his master's degree, his research focused on applying seismic hazard analysis on the San Ramon fault. Currently serving as a research assistant at Universidad Tecnica Federico Santa Maria, working on seismic risk analysis of structures using regional performance-based earthquake engineering methodologies and seismic hazard analysis of the San Ramon fault considering non-Poissonian models. Our second speaker is Dr. Felipe Rivera, an independent consultant and interdisciplinary researcher with more than 10 years of experience working in disaster risk reduction and sustainable development. His doctoral research, conducted at University College London, brought together concepts of socio-environmental justice with seismic risk governance applied to the case of Chile. Felipe is currently an honorary research fellow at Epicenter, a multidisciplinary research center for natural hazards resilience at UCL. He also holds a Master of Research degree from UCL and a civil engineering degree from Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, which is his home country. Now, without further ado, I will hand over to Horacio to begin the talk. So, Horacio, if you can share your screen.
Yeah, I will. So let me know if you can see the presentation.
Yes, we can see the slides. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Evangelos, for that introduction and also for the invitation to talk about a very polemic seismic scenario here we have in Chile. Also, thank you to SECET, the young members, to this opportunity. I am Horacio Domínguez, as Evangelos said. I'm Master Civil Engineering in Federico Santa Maria Technical University, and I did my thesis in seismic hazard assessment of the San Ramon fault in Santiago, Chile. But before talking about the San Ramon fault, I want to talk a little bit about the seismic context we have here in Chile. Chile is located right next to the subduction trench that you can see here of the Nazca Plate under the South American Plate. And the interaction between these two tectonic plates produces 4 types of earthquakes. The first one are the outer rise earthquakes. You can see here an example from 2001. And the epicenter usually of these earthquakes is located really far from populated areas as cities, towns, etc. And they can also only generate moderate magnitude earthquakes. So the hazard they pose to these populated areas is pretty low. Then we have probably the most hazardous source or tectonic source in Chile, that is interface events. These events can reach really high magnitudes, moments of magnitude, such as the Valdivia earthquake, the greatest ever recorded earthquake in history. And due to these high magnitudes, and they are produced nearer than these outer rise events, they pose a really great hazard for the Chilean territory, and they are said to control the seismic hazard in Chilean territory. Then we have the oceanic inslap events. These occur in the oceanic crust, but beneath the continental crust, and they are very deep. However, when the epicenter is located right next to a populated area, they can be really destructive. And here we have as an example the Chilean earthquake in 1939, where that is the most destructive earthquake in Chilean history, even more than these two high magnitude events that are these tectonic interface events. And at last, we have the continental inslap earthquakes. These are produced in active shallow crust faults, and as their name says, they are occurring pretty shallow faults. And again, when located right next to populated areas, they can be really destructive, such as Las Melosas earthquake in 1958. And an active shallow crust fault we have here in Chile is the San Ramon fault, and it's located right next to the most populated area in Chile at the city of Santiago, the capital city. So what do the seismic design codes say about these active shallow crust faults? Well, here's the zonification you can see that is proposed for all these seismic design codes from Chile: residential buildings, industrial installations, seismic isolation and dissipation, non-structural structures, and even bridges respond to this seismic zonification. And as you can see, this seismic zonification is parallel to the subduction trench. So it is accounting for these events that occur in the contact area of both plates that are the interface events. And from all these seismic design codes, only one mentions what to do when you have the presence of another seismic source, that is the seismic isolation code. And it talks about a capable and active fault. The issue here is that there's no definition of what a capable and active fault is. So how do we know we have to consider a fault as a capable and active fault if there's no definition? There's also no justification of why considering a 10-kilometer limit for these capable and active faults. So in this context, one fault that we have been neglecting from our seismic designs is the San Ramon fault. The San Ramon fault, as I told you before, is an active shallow crust fault that is located right at the east of Santiago. In some points, it crosses Santiago in the north and the south of the city. It has been estimated to have 30 kilometers length to 50 kilometer length. However, some authors also proposed that it could be composed by 4 independent segments of 10 kilometers each. So I'm gonna emphasize on this and be repetitive with this. We have a lot of uncertainty regarding the San Ramon fault, as you can see in the length. Also, the width ranges from a proposition of 10 kilometers to 25 kilometers width. The deep ranges between 30 to 65 degrees, and so on and so on. The geometry of the San Ramon fault is really unknown for us. The seismicity of the San Ramon fault is also really unknown for us. We have a lot of uncertainties. And this is also reflected in the maximum magnitude that has been proposed. Gabriel Vargas in 2014 proposed a maximum magnitude of 7.5 by conducting a paleoseismological investigation of the fault. And he also discovered 2 past events, one occurring 17,000 years ago and the last one 8,000 years ago. And so he proposed a return period of 9,000 years. But again, this is a really uncertain parameter because we only have 2 data points to adjust this return period. We don't know how much time it could have been between the 17,000 years ago event and the previous event to that. So there's a lot of uncertainty regarding the San Ramon fault. However, the real problem is when we look at the urbanization along the fault. Gabriel Easton studied the urbanization, and he concluded that by 2017, 55% of the fault's trace has been urbanized over, considering the 30-kilometer trace. And as we can see, there's also a lot of critical infrastructure built within 2 kilometers, also frequently crowded places as commercial centers, and probably the most controversial of all, the Nuclear Research Center of La Reina, that is located within 200 meters from the fault trace, as you can see in this image. So we have a lot of critical infrastructure that has been built really near a fault that could activate or not. It's something in question. And when we have seen similar events along the world that have the same parameters in terms of magnitude and depth, we have seen catastrophic losses. The earthquake of Kobe in Japan in 1995 is an example. Also, the Chichi earthquake in Taiwan in 1999 in terms of depth and magnitude, and at last the Kahramanmaraş earthquake in Turkey in 2023. So our fear is this, that similar earthquakes have catastrophic losses around the world, and we have a lot of critical infrastructure built near the fault. So this is why we ask ourselves, what is the hazard posed by the San Ramon fault to Santiago? And to be honest, this is a question that has already been answered. Two authors already studied the hazard, but using a deterministic seismic hazard analysis. And we also ask ourselves if there are any zones where the hazard posed by the San Ramon fault is greater than the hazard generated by interface and in-slab events. And for me, this is the key question of this investigation, because we want to know if there's have been an underestimation in our seismic designs to the hazard posed in Santiago. So this is why we propose to use both deterministic and probabilistic seismic hazard analysis to assess or compute the seismic hazard posed by the San Ramon fault and compare it to the seismic hazard generated by the subduction events. Subduction events meaning interface and in-slab events. So for those who haven't studied this yet, a seismic hazard analysis consists of estimating the hazard on a study site, on a particular study site or region. And there are two approaches: the deterministic seismic hazard analysis that only consider one seismic scenario. Usually, the seismic scenario is the worst case scenario criteria. And this worst case scenario would be the maximum magnitude of each source and the minimum distance from the study site to this source. So you put those parameters into your ground motion model that is applicable to that particular source. You get the expected intensity, and the result, the hazard, is the maximum intensity. So the deterministic seismic hazard analysis is a really simple criteria. On the other hand, the probabilistic seismic hazard analysis tries to consider all seismic scenarios and their probability of occurrence to estimate the probability of exceeding a certain level of intensity. So in this case, you have to try to estimate all the possible magnitudes you can have in a seismic source. Then you have to evaluate each of these magnitudes. Here's one, for example. You have a relation between the magnitude and the length. In a 3D model, it would be the area instead. And you then estimate the possible distances due to that rupture length. And then you have a probability density function of the distances due to the magnitude. And you combine all this information, the PDF of the magnitude of the distance, and the probability of exceeding a certain level of intensity due to that magnitude, and you get finally the probability of exceeding the intensity level in that study site. So given all that, we propose to use the zone studied by Bustos in the year 2023 of the Santiago Basin. He estimated values of fundamental period and the BS30 of the Santiago Basin. We also select two particular sites on our study zone to compute response spectra, uniform hazard spectra, and hazard curves. Site 1 is located 8.5 kilometers from the trace, and site 2 for me is the most important because it's located right over the fault trace, and it's a parameter that you can say if there is or not an influence zones of the San Ramon fault. On the ground motion model equations or prediction equations selected, we try to keep two Chilean models for interface and in-slab events. However, the IDINI model for high magnitude in-slab events has a really poor constraint, so therefore we couldn't keep it in for our in-slab events. And we also select a more global model as the Abrahamson and Gulerce model. For shallow crust faults, we took into consideration the Akar and Bull models from models from 2014 by the selection criteria of Julian Bomer. So let's talk about the deterministic seismic hazard analysis. I'm going to talk about both the methodology and the results, and then pass to the methodology and results of the probabilistic seismic hazard analysis. In the case of the San Ramon fault model, we did the criteria of the worst case scenario. We chose that criteria. So we choose a magnitude of 7.5 proposed by Jean-Baptiste Amirati, and also his geometry. So it's a 50 kilometers length trace. In the case of the subduction events, we also selected the worst case scenario criteria for choosing the events. In the case of the Inslab earthquake, it would be an hypocenter located right in the middle of our study zone, or more or less in the middle of our study zone and also the middle of Santiago. The depth was estimated from the model of the slab from slab 2 Hayes 2018. And the maximum magnitude estimated from the investigation of Alan Poulos in 2019. We used the same two models for the interface event, the maximum magnitude from Poulos, and also the geometry from slab 2 model from Hayes 2018. So let's go to the results of this deterministic approach. Here we have the response spectra, and as you can see, it's computed for the INSLAB, the interface, and the San Ramon faults event. And you can see that for low vibration periods, the INSLAB event is the one that controls the hazard in both study sites that we have. However, for longer vibration period, we can see that the San Ramon fault is indeed controlling the hazard, so influence zones will appear for longer vibration periods. And it's in particular on study site 1, 2, they will appear from periods greater than 0.5. And they will reach our study site 1 for periods greater than 1 second. So let's see if that is true. When we see seismic hazard maps, here is a computation hazard maps considered a low vibration period, lower than 0.5. We can see that the hazard posed by the subduction events are greater in all the study region than the hazard posed by the San Ramon fault. So there is no influence zones. Here we computed the ratio of the hazard posed by the San Ramon fault divided by the hazard posed by the subduction events. And then values over 1 would be greater hazard of the San Ramon fault. And we can see that all values are lower than 1. So the San Ramon fault is posing a lower hazard than the one that is posed by subduction events. However, when we take into consideration vibration periods higher than 1, so we should reach our study site 1, we can see that in mostly all the half of the region, the hazard posed by the subduction event is greater than the hazard posed by the San Ramon fault, is greater than the one posed by the subduction event. So when we look at the hazard ratio, we see that for half of the region, values are over 1. So we have indeed an influence zone of the San Ramon fault. And moreover, the ratios values almost reach a value of 3, meaning that the hazard posed by the San Ramon fault is almost 300% the one posed by the subduction events. On the other hand, for the probabilistic seismic hazard analysis, we tried to consider all seismic scenarios. So first, we subdivided our San Ramon fault model into a logic tree. First, by the length proposed by Amirati and by Armijo. Then by the maximum magnitude computed from relations between the length of a fault and the magnitude, and from directly the seismic moment. In the case of the 50 kilometer length trace, both values were pretty similar, so we considered one model. And at last, by the possible return period. This is the value that I told you that Gabriel Vargas computed at the beginning. And it has a lot of uncertainty. He proposed an error of 500 years, but however is still having a lot of uncertainty. And an important thing to mention is that as we are considering a constant value of return period, we are considering a characteristic event recurrence model for the San Ramon fault. And it will have a lot of incidence in our results, as you will see. For the subduction model, we considered the 7 zones proposed by Alan Paulus in 2019. He adjusted Gutenberg-Richter laws to all of these models, zones, I'm sorry. So we use also that Gutenberg-Richter laws for the recurrence model. And the geometry was obtained from the SLAP2 model proposed by Hayes 2018. So we computed uniform hazard spectra to both study sites, considering 4 different probabilities of exceedance in the next 50 years. And as you can see, when considering the San Ramon fault or neglecting the San Ramon fault from the results, we have pretty similar uniform hazard spectra. So there is no difference in considering the San Ramon fault or not in our results, and therefore there is no influence of the San Ramon fault in the hazard of these 2 study zones. When we look at seismic hazard groups, the same can be said. When considering the San Ramon fault or neglecting the San Ramon fault, the results are the same, in this case for a low vibration period. However, something really interesting to see here is the hazard curve of the San Ramon fault only. We see that for low intensity vibration, values, the behavior of the curve is constant, and it is constant limited by a 9,000-year return period. This is the value that we assign to the characteristic event model recurrence we chose. And this is the value that I previously told that has a lot of uncertainty. So our result for the hazard of the San Ramon fault, it's really conditioned by a really uncertain parameter. And this also occurs for long vibration periods. It's also limited by this value. So independent of the intensity type we are considering, in this case, the vibration period we're considering, the results are limited by this 9,000-year return period that is really uncertain. And this would also be reflected in our seismic hazard maps. In this case, the probability of exceeding a 1G for a vibration period of 0.3 seconds, it's really low for the San Ramon fault. It don't exceed 0.3%, and in the case of the subduction, it exceeds 25%. So we are talking about values that are really different, and therefore there is no influence of the San Ramon fault when computing the ratio of these both. And this also occurs for long vibration periods. The probabilities of exceeding 0.1 G for 3 seconds of vibration periods are really low for the San Ramon fault, and they reach 20% for the subduction events. So again, there is no influence zone of the San Ramon fault, and even more, the ratio values couldn't exceed 3%. So some comments about what we have seen. The assessment of the San Ramon fault seismic hazard is indeed really crucial to Santiago due to the seismic capacity of the San Ramon fault. It could reach 7.5, and its location, it's crossing Santiago at some points. And as we can see, events similar to this one are really destructive. There are still huge uncertainties on the San Ramon fault seismic parameters, geometry, and previous events. And this, for me, is something that is really important. We need to keep studying the San Ramon fault to have more informed studies and make informed decisions. Results of the hazard ratio map or the influence zones that we saw vary considerably when considering a deterministic approach and a probabilistic approach. The deterministic resulted in a influence zones that cover up to the half of the study region and reached values of 3 in the ratio, in the hazard ratio, and the probabilistic approach didn't result in any influence zones and couldn't exceed 0.3% of the hazard. And at last, the inclusion of active shallow cross faults in Chilean seismic design codes should be studied carefully to don't keep making the mistakes of building critical infrastructure near these seismic sources. So thank you everyone for the attention.
Thank you very much, Horacio. That was a really good presentation.
Thank you.
Let's move on with Felipe, and in the end, we'll have some time for questions. Felipe? We can see your screen.
Yes.
Okay, we can also hear you. Okay.
Great. Thank you. Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation to give this presentation. So I'm thinking especially to Stamatina Mertanu and Evangelos for reaching out last year at SECET conference and inviting me and Horacio to continue this conversation about, as Horacio said, like this controversial fault and seismic scenario for Chile and Santiago. What I will present is part of my PhD research, which I finalized last year at UCL under supervision of Professors Tiziana Rozzetto and John Twigg. And this part of my research has been part of a collaboration project with Catholic University in Chile. So I also acknowledge the contributions of colleagues from UCL and Chile in this discussion, this piece of research. And I'll start with going back to the concepts of how dynamic cities are, right? That they're continuously evolving, and so is knowledge. In this case, the knowledge is referred to a fault that we didn't care much about at first. Then it became somehow relevant, and now, as Horacio has described, is very, very important. Not just from a seismic risk assessment point of view, but also from an urban governance perspective. And as society and knowledge evolve, the complexity and the expectations about disaster risk management also change and become more complex. And the complexity I will refer today is not about the physical phenomena, but instead about the interface of science, politics, and the demands of the communities. Such is the case of the San Ramon fault. And I'll go back to this picture later, just to understand what's the role of grassroots organizations in understanding or dealing with seismic risk. With the San Ramon fault case, then I'll discuss some ideas about the politics behind seismic risk reduction and how is Chile addressing this issue in practice. I'll start by telling you a bit about Chilean seismic risk governance, or the way the country organizes to cope with earthquakes. Then I'll delve into the case of the San Ramon fault and how this is challenging this traditional historical approach to governance. And finally, I'll go into the challenges that the conflict around the fault is posing to different disciplines and institutions in Chile. I'll start with governance. Overall, disaster risk governance refers essentially to how we organize a society in terms of the institutions, the policy, the law, and the mechanisms we have to deal with disaster risk and to inhabit and coexist with our territories. Naturally, accounting for disaster risk accountability, on the disaster risk governance system depends on the context, such as the country, but also the evolving time. So as more basic issues are solved, new, more complex problems arise, and the governance system has to take care of them. For example, in Chile, buildings are now, let's say, seismically safe, and we're now dealing with claims, for instance, about non-structural damage. And also, like, claims are become more fine, perhaps, which is a good problem to have. Perhaps in other countries, it's still about code enforcement in the construction industry, right? So there are nuances there. And it's important that this definition by the UNDRR comes with an annotation, which says that good governance needs to be transparent, inclusive, collective, and efficient. And I think this is important to pay attention to, because issues beyond risk, the issues are beyond risk assessment. And it's not about probabilities or damage only, but it's also about being transparent, inclusive, and collective. And as engineers, and I'm an engineer, we are somehow involved in risk governance, perhaps from a more technical perspective. But these are characteristics about governance what we should be addressing too, because this is what makes good governance. And how is Chilean seismic risk governance overall? Well, it's determined by the high seismicity of the country, as Horacio was mentioning. And here's just like a few examples, a few selected seismic events, only in the central north side of Chile. You cannot even see the Great Valdivia earthquake that Horacio mentioned now. So we have high seismicity, one of the most seismic countries in the world. And what do we do with these earthquakes? Well, we respond. So for every earthquake, for every event, destructive events, we have changes in institutions, we have changes in policy, we have changes in standards, which include the building codes. As you can see here in blue, like the few of the biggest earthquakes, and how like policy has been changing. Now we go back into the last years, the last 25 years, and we can see again more changes, especially after 2010. We can see lots of changes after the Maule earthquake, lots of changes in building codes, in policy, institutions have been changing. And now this shows that in a way we have managed to implement the successful trial and error approach. Today Chile is seismically safe, right? So this high seismicity has been good for us because it has given us lots of chances to try and test our designs, learn from those experiences, and then improve practice. Thus, Chilean seismic risk governance is overall, it's reactive, technocratic, and detached from land use and urban planning regulation. Reactive is good, as in after each event, we learn and improve policy and practice. However, nothing happens if nothing happens. Then how do we deal with something that has not happened, as these events on the San Ramon fault, right? Technocratic means that it's driven by the technical aspect of the problem, and that technology, and in this case, seismically safe infrastructure, is the main solution for a technical problem. The seismic risk governance in Chile is led by a technical earthquake engineering community that is self-regulated, self-convened, but also very small and very homogeneous. So you have a problem of diversity of input in this approach. Finally, in terms of detachment from urban regulation, this means that earthquakes are dealt with through structural design, which is not subject to politics, but at the same time is disconnected from urban policy and politics. Now, this has worked, and so far so good. The question is, what's happening recently? And the alarm started to go off very recently, let's say, with some big crustal earthquakes that showed that we didn't have it all figured out. So we have these events on 2007, 2010, and 2014. We're talking about crustal earthquakes of magnitude 6 and 7 and above 7. So this successful trial and error approach has worked predominantly for subduction earthquakes, but now we're not sure what's going to happen with crustal ones. No? And what about crustal earthquakes? Well, we have several faults, lots of crustal faults. Here's a summary of a review of over 1,600 of them. It was published by Santibáñez and colleagues in 2019. And the thing is that we have lots of different faults. You can classify them according to like where they lay in the tectonic domain. I think what's interesting to highlight about the San Ramon fault is that this is the most popular one, although it's one of the slowest of all the crustal faults, right? So it has the smallest slip rates. And why this happens is, as Horacio was mentioning, has to do with because in Santiago, the biggest, most important city in Chile. So let's focus on the San Ramon fault, about what we know and what we don't agree about. Santiago, the capital of Chile, is a city bounded by mountains, east and west. And to the east, we have the Andes. And along the Andes Piedmont, we have the San Ramon fault. The San Ramon fault crosses the city in a north-south direction across 6 comunas or boroughs that house roughly 2 million people and more than 500,000 dwellings. Now, what do we know about the fault? And Horacio gave a good overview of that, so I will not go into so much details about this. But essentially, we know from research, and then we know a bit about how we have reacted to this knowledge in terms of policy. So already in the 1950s, we had some evidence or acknowledgement of the existence of the fault. And then on top, you see PRIS and PRMS, which are like Santiago urban like master plans that have never accounted for the presence of the fault. As you mentioned, in the 70s, we built the nuclear reactor in La Reina, which is 200 meters from the fault. Although we already knew about it, and we were okay with that. So that was acceptable at the time. But from the 2000 onwards, more evidence started to appear, which essentially started to challenge how we related with the fault. Now, by the 2010, we finally had like the statement that the San Ramon fault is independent and active. And now that we know, we have to do something about it, essentially. And this is how knowledge starts to challenge policy and politics. After some time and more results, we essentially came up to the conclusion that the first thing we should do is monitoring better. So we did, and we started like these 2.5-year projects by the National Seismological Center. And as this information was available for the population or for parts of the population, eventually some like real estate projects started to interact with the fault. And this meant that the San Ramon fault entered the environmental courts. So it's not just a problem of hazard assessment, but it's also a problem of policy and politics. No? And essentially, in the last few years, this information has turned into the intent of modifying the Santiago's master plan, accounting for the San Ramon fault, but nothing has happened in that regard. And also the National Emergency Office, to superseded by different service, is preparing, is being proactive. So it's changing the way our reactive traditional approach. However, the question is, are these good outcomes a result of good processes or right reasons? How did we get there? And that's something that's not really clear to me, at least. What we cannot agree about, and this is just a brief summary of some of the research that Horacio already mentioned, there are lots of things about characterizing, understanding the fault, and we're in very early stages of understanding, and that's why there's lots of uncertainties. No? But essentially, we have two groups. Some research points to a very big 30 kilometers up to 50 kilometers long fault. Others talk about multiple segments with length shorter than or no longer than 10 kilometers. Meaning this impacts, of course, the expected earthquake. So from a deterministic point of view, we're talking about 7 up to 7.5 in some occasions, but other evidences point to events much smaller. So it's around 6.5 or even smaller, less than magnitude 6 in some cases. When we talk about surface rupture, which is one of the main problems that's not accounted for in Chilean building codes, we're talking up to 4 or 5 meters of surface rupture. On the other hand, some research points to less than a meter. Again, in terms of PGAs accelerations, we're talking about over or around 1G close to the fault, and in other cases, much, much less. And we're talking about the possibility that these assessments show that essentially all buildings in Santiago, including those with seismic isolation, may be under-prepared for something this magnitude now. And finally, we're talking about earthquake recurrence. So we're talking about 9,000 years with an uncertainty of 100 years. So then we're talking, and in other cases, about 20,000 years. So is the next earthquake geologically imminent with 500 years of uncertainty? If that's the scenario, then how do we account for this information? It's essentially the problem now. And what we cannot agree about maybe comes down to this deterministic versus the probabilistic approach. Is this like the endless debate? We have issues of science validity, science authority. So who's right, and therefore who is not? Whose information is more accurate? We're dealing with uncertainty. So how sure and precise are you? And then we're also talking about using science to inform policy making. So who knows what? Do we know enough, and who is we? How much is enough? No? So we keep asking experts, and experts, as good experts, they will always say, well, we don't know enough. We need to know more. We need more time. We need more research to reduce uncertainty, which is, of course, great, and that advances knowledge. But then the question is, how is that the timeline of research and knowledge development talks with pressures for action from the communities and from essentially political pressures? So with this, I'd like to just go to the final topic, which is about the different challenges around the San Ramon fault. That is not only about earthquake engineering, but for broader conflicts and with different disciplines now. Because the San Ramon fault case is not about exclusively earthquakes, but predominantly about politics, people, communities, and power. Earthquakes are not exclusively a technical problem anymore. And this is challenging the historically successful risk governance model that we have in Chile. So I come back to this picture, and we can see here like the active fault convenes as Peñalolén forest is untouched. So this is one organization that's been fighting for or against a big real estate project in the Andes Piedmont that is essentially sitting on top of the San Ramon Fault trace. So here you can see on the left was the environmental declaration that the developer did, acknowledging the existence of the fault, but saying that the project sat far from the fault, so like less than a kilometer away. But then some grassroots organizations realized and accessed information about from the research, and with more accurate information about the fault trace, they could see that the project is actually sitting on top of part of the fault trace. So now, this is no longer about the fault or the maximum probability the earthquake. It's about how seismic risk governance become contested, because it's not just about earthquakes again, but it's about politics. It's about like the governor with researchers, with politicians, listening to the population and working with communities to show, for instance, that this project is indeed too close or on top of the fault. But then we don't have a support system that's able to absorb this information and propose mechanisms to deal with them, no? To deal with these issues that are more complex than just agreeing on research or agreeing on parameters of recurrence, but we're talking about urban governance now. So to conclude then, the questions we're asking here when we talk about geophysics and earthquake engineering, we're dealing about magnitude, return periods, PGA, no? And we are kind of still in the early stages of this discussion. When we talk about seismic risk governance and disaster risk governance, we'll talk a lot about the building code, and we talk also about preparedness and mitigation for possible future scenarios, events. But then when we talk about urban planning, we talk about Santiago's master plan and how to update it to account for the fault, or should we account for the fault in this instrument? Are we talking about forbidding construction around the fault? Are we talking maybe about retrofitting and relocation of the people that are already there? As you mentioned, it was estimated that 55% of the fault traces are already urbanized. So if we start forbidding construction there, then what happens also with the people that are already there? And with the people that are close to the fault, and how close, right? So all these questions start to make this scientific discussion a bit more contested, because we're talking about something larger, in this case, urban planning. Sorry. And then finally, when we talk about environmental management and protection about the San Ramon fault, we see we're actually not talking about magnitude and return periods. We're talking about the ecosystem of the Andes Piedmont, which has an intrinsic value and is very important to protect it. We're talking about the possibilities maybe of developing an educational geopark around the San Ramon fault and the trenches that have been dug. So all of these questions in the end are not just about the hazard itself, but we're talking about a matter of how we relate with nature, which essentially has to do with an urban governance problem with a disaster risk management perspective. And this is, I guess, increasingly more important, because we're talking, when we come out of the earthquakes and we go to a broader context, we have Chile is a very hazardous territory. We have several hazards and several events happening essentially every year. Earthquakes, in a way, we haven't had something destructive since 2015. So things are starting to fade away a bit, but then we have increasingly more problems with landslides, fire, mud flows, volcanic eruptions occasionally. And then I think with, well, like this cartoon, I believe this Mafalda cartoon, Argentinian cartoon, summarized it brilliantly, is that, as usual, the urgent things leave no time for the important ones. So what are the issues and the controversies around the San Ramon fault? Is that Chile has a major institutional fragility in terms of land use planning, environmental protection, and disaster risk management, which is even worse when these interact. Now, that problem is being carried into the seismic world, which was somehow independent of all of this until now. The pace of scientific discovery and dialogue becomes influenced and partly determined by social and political needs. And we have issues regarding science authority, validity, uncertainty, and what to do with this knowledge, because once we have this knowledge is available, it's out there, we actually have to act upon it. So how do we do it? And it's something that we have not resolved yet. Finally, is that the reactive paradigm relies on urgency and a disaster window of opportunity. And until that happens, it seems we are bound to status quo, which in an equal country like Chile continues to reproduce and sustain socio-environmental injustices, which now include seismic risk. Whilst earthquakes have been historically a technical problem, they're becoming political. And there's this political need for acting. And this is not necessarily bad, as this implies other groups in society want to be a part of this discussion. And this also raises an opportunity for mainstreaming disaster justice or socio-environmental justice. Now, the challenge is to acknowledge the situation and create the mechanisms for different groups to be influential in risk governance decision-making, using this opportunity to create better and more disaster-resilient communities altogether. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Felipe, for your great presentation. Thank you both very much. It was really nice to see both the technical and the socio-political aspect being covered in the same presentation. So thank you. Now we can devote some time for Q&A session. I can't see anything in the chat, but please feel free to type your questions or just raise your hands and open your mics. Oh, I can see already somebody wants to ask something. Miguel?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, guys. That was great. It's such a pleasure to see something more scientific and something more into almost a philosophical discussion, epistemological, if you want. My question is for Felipe. I understand and I appreciate all the politics of the seismicity and the planning, etc. in Chile. I'm a Chilean as well. I must disclose that. Maybe my accent is giving me away already. But my question is, or what worried me a little bit, is that we might have disagreements on the politics of this, what we do with the scientific information. But when we mix that with what our researchers and scientists and seismic hazard experts are doing, and we put them in the same bag, and we say their research is questionable, I get a bit worried, because you use the word technocrats, and you were sort of implying that we should question the outcomes of science all the time. But I think for matters like this, we don't want that. I only want technocrats designing my seismic hazard, please. I only want colleagues from academia designing, our seismic hazard maps, etc., and our design codes, please. So when you put them all together, it becomes a bit confusing and even irresponsible, because you have a slide where you show, look, this is where we do not agree on. And it's great, we have different possible magnitudes for the earthquake, different rupture lengths, and different return periods, etc. But at least in the framework, on the standard framework of probability seismic hazard, we have tools to deal with those epistemic uncertainties. Those are called logic trees. So it's not that we disagree on that. Yeah, we disagree, but that disagreement exists all over seismic hazard projects around the world. That's why we have logic trees, because we don't have two models that are identical, so we can do things like what Horacio did, for instance, to make reasonable assumptions and come up with something that is reasonable. So how my question now, why are you mixing the seismic hazard part with whatever else comes after in terms of what the society does with this information?
Thanks, Miguel. Let me see if I can comment on that. I agree that we want technocrats dealing with the technical bits, for sure. I think one of my main points I want to convey is that sometimes technicians, we become perhaps just too focused on the technical bits, and we don't understand how this is taken by the rest of society, right? So as we still are not really sure, or we're not really certain about what's happening in the fault, and we need more research, and that's always going to be the case, and we need technicians to do that. The problem is that the urgency for acting is already there. It's already in the communities. It's already in politics and political discussions. And the question then is, how are we going to make those decisions? So essentially, how are we using the research to feed into policymaking? And I don't claim to have the solution for that at all, but I think what I've seen, what I see is that we lack the mechanisms for that. Because if people on the deterministic side of things would say we have to prepare for a 7.5 event and we need to change the building codes and the urban planning and the eventually urban law, that's complex, it's delicate, right? And then maybe if we ask probabilistic people who say, well, this is not that meaningful, and I've had many discussions, my research is qualitative, so I've had many interviews with experts, and many engineers, experts, people involved in the building code development will tell you, well, it's the slow fault, we should just wait and see. Now, wait and see works for our engineering approach, but wait and see maybe doesn't work for emergency preparedness, right? For the former National Emergency Office, doesn't work maybe for the update of local urban regulation. So I think my point is highlighting how we're missing the link, essentially. And if we continue making the decisions from the technical aspects only, as we have done, and I think we've been successful in that, so we have to take care of that and keep that. The need for action and the different timeline is gonna stress the system, right? So it's gonna ask for, or the society is already asking for for answers that we're not ready to address. So the question is, how do we bring incomplete knowledge, let's say unagreed science, and make the best decision we can take with the different groups of society for something that, and again, it's a risk that as a society we have to agree on. But then I think what the problem in Chile is that we don't have the mechanisms for that. I think maybe Horacio, you can comment on this idea of the hazard information, how that may fit other discussions.
Yeah, so I agree in one point, being that we have a huge disagreement between the deterministic and a probabilistic approach. But as Miguel said, that's the good part of a probabilistic approach, giving each model an opportunity to insert in your results. And even more in this case, as you said, we have mostly all probabilistic approach to the San Ramon fault has given that the San Ramon poses almost no hazard. But this is under the Pausonian approach that it's what I presented here. Because we don't consider the time elapsed since the last activation. And as we have that information that mostly all we agree on that the time elapsed is the one that Gabriel Vargas gave, we can compute a more accurate seismic hazard assessment under a probabilistic approach. So for me, that's the way to compute it with the time elapse and be very informed on the probability of having an activation due to the time of the last activation of the fault. So there we can have a more technical focus to understand what is the real hazard of the San Ramon fault. So yeah, I agree a lot of that being the problem, that people don't get an agreement about deterministic and probabilistic approach, but I feel that the feeling is this probabilistic approach using the time elapsed since the last activation.
Okay. Thank you both. Miguel, that hopefully answered your question.
Yeah, that was brilliant. Thank you, guys. I can ask more if nobody wants to talk.
I mean, oh, please go on. Like, I don't see anything else coming up.
No,
So
but if somebody else wants to ask, please go ahead.
is there somebody else that wants to ask any question? Let's see. I can't see anything in the chat, and yeah.
Okay, so let's
please go
continue
on.
the discussion, guys.
Yeah.
When Chileans and Greeks are capitalizing this conversation, I like it. My comment or follow-up comment, especially Felipe, would be, okay, I understand. It's a great conundrum, if you want, that in a way the needs and the demand of the society is catching up and chasing the current state of science, right? The current state of knowledge. But I think we need still to separate those things. And I would like to see the people making the decision about the hazard. So on those things that you said we don't agree on, which is the same case for any probabilistic seismic hazard assessment. And we have tools to deal with those disagreements and epistemic differences, etc. In that input, in that part of the, if you want, in the 4 modules of the PBE, in the hazard one, I would like to see only technical people. It must be only technical people. This is my one thing to take away. But when we put them all together in the same sort of philosophical, political, and epistemological problem, I get a bit worried, you know. And I'm pretty sure that if you in Chile we set up a dedicated committee, which I understand there is one already operating in our national FEMA, called ONEMI, the emergency public office. I'm pretty sure that if you have you allocate the time and the funding for our experts that have contributed to the knowledge in this field, like Horacio is one of those now, I'm pretty sure that something reasonable and probably on the safe side will come out of that and will inform the hazard. And we can leave all the rest to policymakers and the communities, etc., to see, okay, look, if it's worth for them to do their risk assessment, is it worth for me to keep pushing for having a mall here or for having, you know, a super tall building next to the fault? Is their choice, you know, and there might be a regulation that said, look, you cannot do it. And if you do it, do your own risk, you know, but at least the hazard part has to keep remaining technocratic. This is my only point.
Yes, thanks. And I completely agree with that. I of course, like, I think technical knowledge has to be dealt with by technicians. I agree with that, absolutely. I think, and so this was told to me by one of my interviewees, a geoscientist, an academic in Chile. He told me, so one thing is to use these results, research results, which of course is not the truth, right? I mean, it's, but these research results, one thing is to use them to inform, for instance, preparedness. No? So maybe we run lots of simulations, we have deterministic, probabilistic information, we combine it, and we say, you know, what's likely to happen is that this type of earthquake occurs in this point and affects this part of the city. And then, like, the Senapred can say, okay, so now this is how we deal with preparedness. And perhaps we start working on evacuation plans, campaigns, retrofit campaigns, similar. But then another completely different thing is changing urban law, changing the local urban regulation plans, right, at the comunas levels, which are essentially what will tell you if you can build or not the more critical infrastructure, shopping mall, or whatever. And the problem is that thus far in Chile, like, those decisions, urban decisions, have never accounted for, like, disaster risk information, and especially not regarding earthquakes, because earthquakes have always been dealt with at the individual structure level. So we make very good buildings and we account for instance, for the soil in the foundations. But then we've never seen it in an aggregated way. And the problem is that the decisions about the master plan are informed by technical results or technical information about the hazard or about the exposure or about the risk. But in the end, the people that make those decisions are not technicians. And they could completely disregard, and it has happened, that they completely disregard this information because, you know what, communities want the shopping mall, and I want to be re-elected into office, so I'll do it. So then again, it's not necessary. The fact that planning is informed by technical information, but it's still political. And this is what I mean, that it's okay that technicians do technical and politicians do political, but I think we have to meet at the interface of these worlds, because if technical people don't start talking about politics or understand the language, at least, of the social environmental conflicts, then we are not really feeding the proper information to the discussion. And I think that's my point. I mean, that's why I made this comment at the beginning about governance, like governance as understood by the UNDRR, no? So like kind of like the authority in a way, or the agreement about this is that it has to be transparent and inclusive. So how inclusive are we being if we're only engineers or geophysicists dealing with the hazard assessment, which of course only for the hazard assessment makes sense. But when we feed that information into the process, if we're still only engineers making that decision, I'm sure at the at society's level, it's going to be incomplete.
Great, thanks, Felipe.
I guess just connecting with the hazard, no, like, and just to ask Horacio about this, I guess, is like, it's different evidence will point to different possible earthquakes, no? So it's different to prepare for a 7.5 event to a 5.8 event with 4 meters surface rupture against 50 centimeters surface rupture. And then again, this also challenges because knowledge is cumulative now. So what we knew in 2020 is different from what we know today. Like these probabilistic assessments are very recent, 2023, 2024, but deterministic dates to 2010. And like policies have been, advocacy for policies has been done since 2010 with early information. And maybe now we know something else. I'm not saying it's more valid or that it changes what we knew before, but then how much or when do we take the actions, right? And that's why I think it's complicated, because at least in Chile, we don't have the mechanisms to account for that. Like the evolution is, our laws or our tools are not that dynamic or that flexible in a way, for a good reason. But then it comes with this problem of, well, we know something more now, and then the advocacy we did for 10 years maybe is not necessarily the same, but things have a momentum, especially when we're talking about changing urban law.
Yeah, I also have some comments about this. You mentioned the mall example of like when you or technocrats give this impression that you shouldn't build in some part, and the major or the governance says like, yeah, but we need a mall with the people are asking for a mall, so I'm gonna build it anyways. This is what I think Miguel is trying to say, that's why we like informed people that are made the hazard assessment should maybe have more participation or saying in this, because even though he's giving them all people ask, he's like affecting the safety of these people by constructing them all anyways and not hearing or only by following their political reasons of elections or any stuff that he got benefits by them all. And also the last thing that you said, yeah, it's true. We have every year new information about the San Ramon fault, but that is why we should be updating the laws. And obviously that's a really low process, and it won't be as fast as we get new information of the San Ramon fault, but it's something that must have done, and every law in every topic is updating as the scientific data or any type of data is updating. So yeah, that's the issue I think we have here.
Okay. Thank you both. Thank you, Miguel, for prompting this very interesting conversation. Thank you. Is anybody else in the call that would like to ask anything to our two speakers? I don't see anything in the chat. I don't see anybody raising the hand. Yeah, just also like maybe just a comment from me. I think there might be countries that have very good engineers, and we might have all the necessary tools in our disposal, but it's not just about preparedness and how the government is prepared for this kind of disasters. It's also like how we apply all this knowledge when we get to the construction phase. Because you might have the right design codes, you might have all the tools, you might have good engineers, but when you reach to actually constructing something, maybe the regulations will not follow exactly how they're supposed to be. And then again falls into the political spectrum of the engineering sector. So I think it's important that we as engineers, we need to understand, as Felipe said, how to speak this language and how to keep advocating for the right thing to be done in all phases of our project, from research, from conception, when we go to design and construction and maintenance. Okay, so not sure if there is anybody else that would like to ask anything. Raise your hand or type a question in the chat.
Evangelos, can I ask questions to Horacio, please?
Yes, of course, of course.
So, Horacio, in your model, you're using, of course, a Poissonian approach. My question is, how do you expect the model to change if you were not to use one, and what do you need for you to be able to consider it?
Okay, to consider the time elapsed since the last activation. Okay, yeah, we did that investigation with Professor Pablo Resi, my former thesis advisor. And yeah, there is an increasing in the seismic hazard. But as I told before, we have an agreement of that the last activation was 8,000 years ago. And all the research have found that the return period of the fault is greater than 9,000 years. So there we have an issue because the probability of having an activation using we used a Brownian passage time model of a 9,000 year return period fault with 8,000 years elapsed is still very low. But as the years keep running, that probability will increase. And that is something we have to take into consideration of urban planning of buildings that will stay lots of years there, like hospitals or critical infrastructure that expect a return period of 2,475 years, even though they won't be built that much time. But you have to make that in the consideration. And something that affects really highly the results is the period of time you consider. So we computed them considering the probability of activation in the next 50 years, and it's obviously really low. We have a really low probability of seeing an earthquake in the next 50 years of the San Ramon fault. But what if we consider 1,000 years? Then you reach the return period of the fault. So the probability increases a lot. So this 50 years window that we always use in probabilistic seismic hazard assessment, that it's really arbitrary. It's a real has a real impact in a Brownian passage time model. And this is a question: which window do we use? Should we use the window of what we expect the building should be the life expected by the building? So it increases the values, but in a 50-year window, almost nothing. It doubles, but it's still really low in comparison to the subduction event.
Brilliant. Thank you, Horacio.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm not sure if anybody else would like to ask anything. To be fair, I'm more than happy to pass over any questions you might have over to our speakers even before the end of this talk. So please feel free to use our official second young members email, which is in our website. And yeah, I don't see anything else coming to the chat or nobody raising their hands. So I would just like to thank you both very much for accepting the invitation and for giving this very interesting talk that covered both the technical and the sociopolitical aspect. And yeah, on behalf of the SECET, I wish you all the best with your future research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Evangelos, for the invitation, and also the Young SECET committee, and Felipe also for the presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Evangelos, for the invitation, for organizing this webinar, and thanks everyone for attending.
Okay, thank you all. Just a reminder that the event has been recorded and will be soon uploaded to our SECET YouTube channel that I have pasted in the chat. And please stay tuned because more events are going to follow. Thank you very much and have a great day.